been achieved over the last 10 years. I wanted to take you through a little journey from when I started in this space to now, and have some reflections on the origins of the PRI, and then also a few thoughts about where we could go. So these remarks are framed around what I believe are three eras: the SRI era, and then the ESG era, which I think is the last decade really shepherded by the PRI, and where I think we're heading, which I call the impact era. Now, I came firmly out of the SRI era. I had shoulder-length long hair. That hasn't quite lasted. But a lot more has happened in the last 12 years. So I started as an internet activist for the Wilderness Society in Australia. We were filing shareholder resolutions on a big forestry company in Australia, which, by the way, went from old growth logging to now FSC certified logging, almost exclusively because of the activism of the organisation I was working for. But I did a Masters of Environmental Management, and I did a thesis on socially responsible investment. And at that time, there were two main themes. There was SRI screening and there was shareholder activism. There had been some community investment in the 90s, but mostly in Australia, certainly, there were those two limbs. And I looked at those two limbs as an activist and a social change person, and I said, how can finance be used to create the most good in the world? And I compared those two strategies, and I came down pretty strongly on the side of shareholder activism. I said, yes, negative screening and positive screening and so on, it's great if you want to align your values, but I actually want to change the world. And so I said, well, shareholder activism has demonstrable decades of evidence and a track record of actually changing corporate behaviour. So I signed up to a PhD thesis at Sydney Uni and got 4 years of funding. And then in the time before my thesis was to start, I went to the UN UNEP Finance Initiative in Geneva as an intern. And, you know, I think a lot about the balance between luck and skill, and I think I've been extremely lucky. I was lucky enough to have Paul Clements-Hunt as the boss. Is Paul here somewhere? Paul was a fantastic boss and had this unit within UNEP FI, which was a bunch of young people with a huge amount of energy, really getting things done and really pushing the boundaries. So Paul really let us work on a project, and in my 6th week as an intern, we were also working with the Global Compact and Gavin Power, who was supported very strongly by Georg Kell. Gavin had been working on a project called Who Cares Wins, which was one of the first publications on how finance sector, how issues can be material in the finance sector, ESG issues. In parallel, UNEP FI had been developing a publication called The Materiality of Social, Environmental and Governance Issues to Equity Pricing. And these two units came together, and we were looking for ways that we could really build momentum in this space. And so I pitched this idea to Paul. I said, let's create a set of principles for responsible pension fund engagement. So the original idea was a kind of a stewardship code for getting ESG issues engaged, getting pension funds engaged with ESG issues. And then quickly we brought the agenda of Gavin's through the Who Cares Wins at the Global Compact and the Asset Management Working Group through the materiality work of Paul and Jacob Malthouse and Gordon Haggart and others in the team, and brought them together and said, let's make this a set of principles for responsible investment more generally. And then there was also another great development in 2004. There was the Freshfields report, which was the first legal opinion that said not only is it compatible with fiduciary duty to incorporate ESG issues into investment processes, but where they're material and relevant, it's actually required. And why wouldn't you do it if they're material and relevant? And so having a law firm actually say, which is something which is kind of obvious, actually made a huge difference to this movement. So what were the key pieces that went into the PRI drafting process? So we were working on this, this idea that ESG issues can be material. They should be taken into account. They're being overlooked now by the finance sector, and the finance sector should take into account a much broader range of issues. This idea that stewardship and shareholder engagement is vital and could really make a difference if we could mobilize the world's capital to come together and pool their resources and influence companies in a positive way. And there was a big push on transparency. We had the Equator Principles in project finance, we had the Global Reporting Initiative, the Global Compact had its communications on progress. And really those were the big themes that went into the drafting process of the PRI. And what came out was really those pillars. Principle 1, incorporation of ESG issues into investment processes. Principle 2, active ownership. Principles 3 and 6 that were all about transparency, and the other principles were about collaboration and addressing the investment chain. So we ran the drafting process in 2005. We had virtually no budget. We were going to these meetings with the world's largest investors. We got Kofi Annan to, through Gavin and Georg, to write a letter to the world's biggest pension funds and invite them to come to UN headquarters to commit to developing a set of principles for responsible investment. But we really we really bootstrapped this initiative, and I think when people look at the PRI today, they forget really how it started. I remember one event in Toronto, an expert group meeting. We had about 80 people in tables of 10 workshopping all aspects of the principles. And we didn't have enough budget to bring many of the team to Toronto. And so Paul generously gave up his travel allowance, and we booked out a 4-person bunk room, backpackers room, so that we could actually bring some junior members of the team to Toronto to participate. And I think that really sums up the spirit of the early years of the PRI. It was a scrappy, poorly budgeted, entrepreneurial group. I remember in the lead up to the launch at the New York Stock Exchange, I only got 1 week's worth of travel allowance. And the UN's travel allowance is very generous on a per-night basis, but I had to spend 6 weeks in New York preparing for this huge launch at the New York Stock Exchange. So I said, well, how am I going to spread my 1 week's allowance over 6 weeks? So there's this backpackers in Times Square called the Big Apple Hostel, and I would be in a room with like 8 other bunks, and I'd get dressed in my suit every morning and walk over to the UN headquarters, and all these South African backpackers would look at me like, can't you afford a hotel, man? Like, what's going on? But I guess that's really the commitment that in the early years we had. We really wanted to make a difference, and we saw the potential of this initiative getting the asset owners together, the world's largest pension funds, and then the world's largest asset managers together to develop a set of principles. So here's the famous photo of the launch of the PRI at the New York Stock Exchange in April 2006. There'll be some people there. I think there's Priya, Daniel Simar. Who else was there on the stage? Gavin, Paul Clements Hunt. It was a great day. I was down in the down on the trading floor, and all of the traders were saying, "What's that? Is that a new company listing today?" And I said, "No, it's an initiative on responsible investment from the UN." And this guy said, "And who's the black guy in the middle?" And I think what's really important is how far we've come now in terms of the UN and the PRI and the Global Compact really being embedded in conversations in this responsible investment space. So then we launched the PRI. I was the first and only employee. The second employee, Jerome Tager, there at the back, So Jerome and I were the PRI for quite some time, and then we grew it very quickly. I won't go into all of the actual work program of the PRI because I think you're probably all familiar with it, and the document talks about everything that we've done over the years. But I'd have to say that I think the PRI Engagement Clearinghouse was really our effort to try to realize that vision of bringing investors together, pooling their resources, pooling their influence, and pushing for real change in corporations. I think the reporting and assessment, I think, is absolutely unique, and had the PRI not come to this space with the legitimacy of the UN partners, the investment industry certainly wouldn't be reporting out in the way they are now. When we started, there were probably less than 30 investors reporting. Now there's over 1,000, and really reporting in quite some detail, and I'm sorry about that. But we did, I spilt a lot of political capital with my board, who supported most things, but we had some good battles over the reporting and assessment process. And I think we got a good balance in the end. That's a really robust process which pushes people along, and as a signatory now through Tau Investment Management, I actually had to do the reporting myself, and with help from staff, of course. But it was very useful. I'd like to also just acknowledge the role of the board during that process. Donald McDonald, Wolfgang, who's here, and Glenn Saunders also. The board was very challenging. Boards should be challenging, and I think having that asset owner board with later on the asset managers joining has created a really great foundation for the legitimacy of the initiative. So I left 10 years to the day when I started at the UN, which was 2.5 years ago, and leaving the PRI in the capable hands of Fiona, who's done a fantastic job over the last couple of years. Now I've been away for a couple of years, I wanted to just reflect on a few things. So I'm now working in private equity part-time, upgrading garment factories in countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So really on the ground, working out how we can really deliver profitable change within companies and the base of the pyramid workforce. I'm also teaching a program at Harvard for the next generation of ultra-high net worth family members. So we partnered with the World Economic Forum, which is a group of, which has the family business community, which is a group of multi-billion-dollar families, and we are teaching the next generation of ultra-high net worth family members how to do impact investing. Now, what I've thought and learnt over the last couple of years since leaving the PRI is really we do face just tremendous problems in the world and huge challenges. And a lot of the conversation in the ESG space is, especially in public equities, is just tweaking the edges. And we really need to recognize what is true impact and what are true solutions and what's great, but maybe not contributing nearly as much. I also really concluded that investors can play an absolutely tremendous impact if they really want and they really step up. I've seen investors in the developing world. I've seen the development finance institutions, which I feel there should be much greater collaboration between pension funds and development finance institutions like the IFC and CDC and Proparco and Obviam. They are doing incredible work, and many of them have some tremendous returns in private equity, private debt in developing countries, and they are on the ground really making a difference, and there's huge potential there. But I've also come to the conclusion that there's a really big difference between taking into account ESG sustainability issues and making a concrete difference on the world. And I think in a lot of conversations, those two get mixed up. And just because you take into account ESG issues doesn't at all necessarily lead to you actually making a difference in the world. And I think we have to be intellectually honest about when we say, I'm taking these issues into account, well, great. that's fine, and that may align values, and that might manage risk, and you may even outperform doing that. But what I'm talking about in moving from that era, from the ESG era, which I think is more about a taking into account era, to an impact era, which is saying, yeah, not only are we taking into account, of course we are, that's a necessary prerequisite, but now let's actually look at how we can deliver real change in companies. So the impact era, that's where I think we're heading in the next 10 years. Why do I think we need to move from the ESG era to the impact era? Well, there was a discussion of millennials. So I teach millennials from very wealthy families, and they are fundamentally different. We're also running a research project on millennials and wealth, and I can guarantee you that the millennial generation, with the inheritance of $40 trillion, it's a crazy amount, is going to be inherited. They have fundamentally different values in terms of alignment across family business, across investment portfolios, and across strategic philanthropy. This generation has grown up on mobile phones and internet and access to information, and in a way that previous generations don't. I know it's a cliche, but I've been working for a couple of years now with this generation, a particularly well-heeled demographic of this generation. But I can tell you there is a fundamental change happening here. Impact is also capturing the attention of clients in a way that I think SRI, ESG, mission-aligned as terminology didn't. People love the idea of impact, creating positive impact in the world in a way that aligning or others didn't quite do. John Goldstein, who's the CEO of Imprint, who just got bought by Goldman's, had a great quote I heard last year where he said, "For me, ESG issues are what keep me up at night, and impact, creating impact, is what makes me get up in the morning." And I think that's really, if you can think, wow, I can actually create change and make a difference to the world, that is really inspiring. And I think that's what clients want to hear. We're entering an unparalleled era of transparency. I mean, we saw in the Rana Plaza factory collapse, within minutes, people were snapping on their phones the labels of brands that were in that pile of rubble. There will be nowhere to hide soon. The mobile phone penetration in Vietnam went from 19% in 2014 to 30% in 2015. It's extraordinary how fast it's growing. And not only phone penetration, smartphone penetration. They're getting low-cost Android smartphones down to below $30 price point. They're going to be everywhere. They're going to be ubiquitous. And this is why I'm saying we need to move from this taking it into account era to actually responding, because you're going to get caught at some point with some dodgy companies in your portfolios. And it's just going to become more and more transparent, which brings me to the activists. The activists are going to become more and more effective. Now, Occupy Wall Street was, I mean, just a trial run of the trial run. You know, you've got the divestment movement and 350.org, and the way people are engaging is just, I think, getting more and more sophisticated. And that's going to fundamentally change not how accountable you want to be to your beneficiaries, but it's going to change how accountable society, how accountable you're going to be to society at large. And you're going to have to move away from this paradigm that it's just between us and our beneficiaries. It's not. You're an institution. Every organization here is an institution in society. You have a license to operate from society. Many regulations are in place which determine how and why every organization here exists. And the expectations are going to be dramatically greater. I had lunch this week with the CEO of change.org. I mean, it's a civic engagement platform which is fantastic. They're raising tens of millions of dollars. I mean, we're not talking about little NGO activists anymore like what I used to do. These are serious businesses that are building engagement platforms which are going to empower millions and millions of people. And I think the pension fund engagement space is only just beginning. And finally, I think you look at the US political situation and you've got Bernie Sanders on one side and you've got Donald Trump on the other side bashing Wall Street and the finance sector equally hard. And this is a really powerful backlash against what people see as the finance sector not actually delivering positive change for the world. So these are kind of the reasons why I think this impact and positive demonstrable impact movement is going to happen. So what do I mean by impact? Well, I mean ESG integration is necessary, but it's not even close to being sufficient. Serious shareholder engagement, really stepping up, demanding improvements in corporate behaviour, and voting. I mean, there are still PRI signatories that are voting 100% with management. I mean, what's with that? Stepping up on public policy. There's, again, I've mentioned this before, 3,000 registered finance sector lobbyists in Washington, D.C. alone. How many of them are lobbying for the types of things we've been talking about today? A dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, I don't know. But not very many. Lobbying has to get serious, and that's a really important piece. And sustainable and impact private equity, private debt, including in developing countries. I'm working in that space now. There's huge potential. Of course, everyone's scared of investing in countries they don't quite understand, but I think there are huge opportunities, and it's a matter of getting more proactive. So, going to the impact era, I think going back, how can we create as much positive impact as possible within what we've got? So just going full circle, I wanted to circle back. The impact era is only possible because of the foundation that we've built through the PRI and other similar organisations. We've now got thousands of professionals in responsible and sustainable impact investing that just weren't there when the PRI started. We had 100 people to our first PRI annual event. Last year in London, there were 1,200. I'd say there's probably more than 12,000 people who attend events that are specifically called ESG, responsible investment, sustainable investment, impact investment, maybe 20,000. This is a fundamentally different thing, and I think the PRI has been a huge part of building this movement and building it significantly faster than it would have done organically, because the PRI managed to leverage the UN legitimacy, the asset owners, the world's largest investors, the world's largest asset managers, bring them all together within a fiduciary framework rather than a confrontational framework. And I think that's something we can be really proud of. So, as I said when I left the PRI, thank you. So as I said, when I left the PRI, you're on the right side of history in this movement. I think your grandchildren will be proud of what you're doing to try to make finance really part of the solution, not just part of the problem. So now let's use the momentum of the first 10 years of the PRI that we should be really proud of to really build on that and move from this ESG era to the impact era, and not only be on the right side of history, but let's make history. Thank you.